Are you bored of YouTube content? Do you want to try something new and interesting and fun? Then check out
Radio Free Intimate, episode 382. How's that for a sales pitch? Not a sponsor. So this episode's been a long time in the making. It actually started out as a follow-up to another episode I had spent quite a bit of time working on, episode 381, Texas Death Metal That Isn't Devourment, which if you haven't watched or listened to that yet, I would recommend it. I don't know, I feel like it was a pretty good episode. This hypothetical episode probably would have been called something like Ohio Death Metal That Isn't Regurgitation, and it would have started out with a similar intro to the Texas episode, where I would explain why regurgitation wasn't on there. Although in this case, it's slightly different than what I had going on with Devourment, a band that I'm kind of 7 out of 10 lukewarm on. In this case, Regurgitation, I think they're pretty great. They're kind of at the same point in my metal hierarchy that bands like Wombbath, see episode 195, from Sweden, or Demigod from Finland, episode still forthcoming, were at for me like 10, 15 years ago, where I could tell, okay, this is definitely some kind of classic. I know I'm going to like this, but it hasn't fully clicked with me all the way yet. For whatever reason. That's where Regurgitation is at for me right now, and that's why they wouldn't be on the Ohio Death Metal episode. Then I would go through 3 Ohio bands that I thought were pretty neat, and then at the end, I'd say my goodbyes. Then there'd be something of a pointed barb at certain detractors of mine, where I'd start listing things off like, what about Embalmer? What about Heinous Killings?
What about Kernugia? What about Drogheda? What about Ceremony? What about Decrepit? What about Nunslaughter?
What about Spawn of Satan? What about Hemdale? What about Trioxin? What about Necrotic Disgorgement? What about Bloodsit? What about Lucifixion?
You know, just as a response to all these, what about this, what about that type people that think they're so fucking smart.
Bitch ass troll. You got Cobra Swarm.
You know, another classic 3-band episode from ye old Radio Free Innsmouth. But I ended up running into a bit of a problem.
3 bands
Will do fine.
No, they won't.
3 bands
Will do fine.
No, they won't. One of the bands in particular that I planned on covering ended up monopolizing so much of my time over the past month or so. Like, I've probably listened to their whole discography multiple times a day, going back weeks and weeks, that it became clear that this band in question was gonna have to get their own episode. That band being, of course, Clean Flesh, from the eastern suburbs of Columbus. Now, if you've heard of these guys at all, it's most likely you recognize them as the first band of one Joseph Wolf, who's most famous nowadays for his solo project, Heinous Killings, which introduced the world to the rather unique style of death metal vocalization lovingly known nowadays as the...
motherfucker.
Predator croak, which I'm sure we all know and love. Clean Flesh was kind of his intro to the death metal scene. And unlike with Heinous Killings, this was a band proper. It wasn't just a project. But like Heinous Killings, this was a drum machine band. That said, it was a very different style of drum machine band. It didn't really have much in common with stuff like Mortician or Chainsaw Dissection, or Fluids, or Putrid Pile. The closest comparison I can come up with would maybe be Insidious Decrepancy, but even then it's pretty far off. And a lot of that has to do with the way this band utilized the drum machine. For starters, it doesn't sound like the drum machine other bands at the time were using. Most bands use some kind of Roland. I don't even know what the hell this is. But you can also tell the way he's programming it is much more phrasally oriented as opposed to just needing drums in the background because it's a death metal band. Like, you can actually hear where the riffs are gonna go just listening to the drum machine. There's been a lot of thought put into the drum arrangements. It almost kind of seems like some weird cybernetic Terminator version of Mike Smith from Suffocation. Like, dun 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 dun. Yeah, I don't know, that seemed a lot funnier in my head. They can't all be winners, folks. Point is, the combination of an utterly unique drum machine sound for the genre with a very detail-oriented eye turned towards drum arrangements results in a very unique style of postmodern cybernetic death metal. To the point where it honestly doesn't even feel like a drum machine to me. It helps that the riffs themselves are also very, very catchy. And while his Predator vocals haven't quite been fully developed yet, Joe still sounds completely unique in Clean Flesh. Particularly for 1997, not too much out there sounded this fucking bonkers. I'd put him up there with Matty Way, Auntie Bowman, even Frank Mullen in terms of his importance as far as the elevation of death metal vocals as an art form goes. Who else was doing that in 1997? But it's not just all about Joe's vocals on this. The instrumentals, as you're hearing, are also quite impressive, being sort of a blend of hyper-modern, early nascent, technical brutal death with a more old-school style of death metal riffage. And with that more old-school style, you're gonna get some amazing guitar soloing from Rick Smith and Steve Haas. Whether it be this kind of bendy, suffocation-oriented material or a more exotically melodic sort of Chuck Schuldiner thing, like you're hearing right now. Usually, your weird Midwestern drum machine death grind band isn't going to have this level of lead guitar playing. Now, that song we just listened to, entitled Coprophagy, which of course is a fairly fancy Latinate way to refer to the act of eating.
Number 2
was very much a brutal death metal song. Clean Flesh definitely working within the brutal death metal subgenre. But they aren't just that. There's a whole lot of weird, interesting variety to the type of death metal that these guys were cranking out. You got this song, Immoral Sex Habit, starts out very death grind before it heads into a much more slam-oriented sort of groove death metal direction. And eventually that slam riff circles back on its tail a couple times to lead us into the vocals, which are very much an embryonic form of Joe Wolf's famous
ugly motherfucker
Predator vocals. But then they hit you with this fucking riff. This ain't normal brutal death metal. This is almost kind of doomy and melodic, sludgy even, and yet it fits in with the rest of the brutal death metal going on around it, particularly once they kick up the drum performance to more brutal death metal speeds and add Joe's vocals back over on top of it. That's what I mean when I'm talking about riff variety, but also very coherent composition. Like this much more death grindy counterpoint riff preserves sort of the emotional feel of that doom riff while leading back into a much more standard brutal death metal kind of mode. It also has its own cool sort of groove-oriented counterpart right here, with this more kind of cymbal shuffly part that eventually is going to bring us back to the more standard Clean Flesh style stuff. This kind of like mid to late 90s era of brutal death metal is always going to be my favorite because of stuff like that. You know, the genre hadn't been entirely codified and corporatized yet, so you would get bands that would be willing to try all sorts of weird things, like when Cryptopsy throws in a riff like... or when Suffocation mixes it up with a little bit of that. Clean Flesh's 1997 self-titled EP is full of that same sort of exploratory spirit, and that's why it's become something of a modern classic within the deeper levels of the death metal underground. It's also a very cult sort of recording, where there was like 350 copies originally printed, 100 of them were stolen and later accidentally destroyed. So if you did manage to get an original copy of this album, you're going to be spending like $400 on Discogs.
Wow, expensive!
Luckily, that's not as much of an issue nowadays because a pretty cool little label called Burning Dogma Records, operating out of Texas, has seen fit to reissue that Clean Flesh EP, along with a whole bunch of stuff from other really cool, kind of forgotten bands like Dead End, Flesh Grind, Hidden Pride, Repudiation, Wicked Innocence. So nowadays, you can easily get that Clean Flesh EP. And it's good stuff, but that's not the reason that Clean Flesh are getting their own episode. Oh no, because in addition to their EP back from the 90s, Burning Dogma has also reissued an even less well-known Clean Flesh release, that being a sort of rehearsal demo that was originally limited to 20 copies from the year before this EP, entitled Basement of Death. Now this live rehearsal demo, whatever the fuck it is, who knows? This is actually tied with Cinturi's Disgorging the Dead as being the coolest death metal discovery I've made within the past year or so. Alright, this rehearsal is absolutely essential shit. For starters, the sound on it is actually pretty damn good, particularly with regard to David Gayer's bass parts. Actually sounds better than the EP as far as instrumental separation goes in that regard. The whole demo rehearsal, whatever, it's got a really cool, crepitant, fucked up sound to it, but you can still hear everything that's going on. But more importantly than that, it also functions as something of a Clean Flesh full-length release. And in fact, only one song from that EP is repeated here. The rest is all new stuff. Like the song you're hearing right now, My Fantasy, this wasn't on the Clean Flesh EP. And it's a really cool little bit of a groovy, brutal death metal. I chose to start off my analysis of the Basement of Death rehearsal tape with this particular song because it's the one that's kind of closest in style to the Clean Flesh EP that came out a year later. It's kind of the most normal sounding song on here because as fucked up as that Clean Flesh EP was, it doesn't have shit on how fucking insane Basement of Death gets. In some ways, it's kind of a pinnacle of a certain fucked up strain in death metal. Like, let's say you go back to 1987, you get a riff like on Death, Scream Bloody Gore that's already way more fucked up sounding than any of the more normal thrash metal going on around it. Then you fast forward to 1993, you take that same sort of riff, you give it to the Finns and Demi-Lich, and you end up with whatever the fuck this is. What happens when you take that same riffing style even farther? You give it to a totally bonkers, alienated sort of band like Clean Flesh. You're gonna end up with this fucking monstrosity. Yeah, that's pretty fucking screwed up sounding. And then they do the counterpoint. It's this ultra primitive sort of groove riff. I know the whole caveman thing is kind of played out, but this literally does feel like something a Neanderthal would write while whacking a rock with like a bone. But then that obelisk lands and they take it to a completely new dimension of sound. Another one of those weird, sludgy, semi-melodic kind of riffs that also brings its own fucked up sort of follow-up riff along for the ride. And you do all of that with this Basement of Death fucked up rehearsal atmosphere. You just get some of the craziest fucking death metal ever. I love it. Like this blasting section right here, it reminds me a lot of very early Immolation, but just even more fucked up. Like, bro, check out that fucking death grind. That shit's tasty. And it goes beautifully back into that weird, bendy, fucking sludgy, impending, apocalyptic sort of riff. So this rehearsal, it's got great early brutal death metal. It's got that weird reinterpretation of a lot of old school death metal. But also, there's a lot of tracks that really lean into the rehearsal aspect, where it feels like they're putting on some kind of show for you. Almost sort of a
Boo! Haunted house!
Wizard of Gore, blood-sucking freaks style horror exhibition. Like, bro, what the fuck even is this intro? Fucking weird.
Well, you better let the poor guy out!
There's a real cinematic sort of quality to the longer songs in this album. These build-ups leading into some more of that tasty kind of early brutal death metal riffage that I personally can't get enough of. And then this next part right here gives me big time like early incantation vibes, but again, filtered through the fucked up lens that is Clean Flesh's screwed up way of looking at death metal history. Just a really grimy, dark sort of atmosphere, again enhanced by that rehearsal feeling. It's not black metal, but it has the same sort of atmospheric focus as a lot of the black metal I like. And then this riff happens, and it totally flips everything on its head.
Hell was that?
On the audio commentary disc for Isengard's Vinterskugga compilation, Fenriz referred to something he called fucked up horror death metal. The sort of thing you'd hear on those 80s Isengard albums, early Dark Throne releases, early At the Gates type stuff. We're talking that sort of kind of thing you'd hear on Soulside Journey. Clean Flesh takes that style and marries it to this brutal death metal, fucked up grimy porno grind sort of thing, and it gives you some of the most unique sounding death metal ever. I don't know how you can hate on a riff like that. It's fucking nasty sounding. And then we go back into that weird knocking under the floorboard shit that introduced the song. You know something fucked up's gonna be climbing out of that basement. And sure as shit, it's some more of that great bizarro guitar soloing that is such an important component of what makes Deeds of Flesh a very special sort of band. You gotta love that. You gotta love them leaning back into that weird incantation, but even more screwed up style of riffing. And as fucked up as this song, Living Beneath, is, it's not even the most fucked up sounding track on this rehearsal. That award has to go to the song right before it, Suicidal Thoughts, my personal favorite Clean Flesh song. The main riff on this track is this bizarre blend of slam death with that weird sort of sludgy anti-melody they're so fond of. Then of course you get more of that tasty kind of death grind riffage that these guys are so good at playing. But once you make it through this churning section, things take another turn for the sort of cinematic. You think they're going to go back into that slam, but instead everything drops out except for drums and foreboding bass guitar. Really got that fucked up basement of death atmosphere to it. And then the guitar comes back in, and it's this like neo-psychedelic clean guitar sort of freak out. It's always interesting when a really brutal death metal band like Suffocation or Enmity manages to work a clean guitar section in, because the way these guys use clean guitar, it's not your normal sort of death metal clean guitar. It's kind of its own genre in itself. It maintains that fucked up, depraved, depressive feeling with that different sonic profile. And yeah, the death metal is gonna come back. You'll get that back! Get that churning sort of riffage again, but coming after that clean guitar kind of puts a whole new spin on it, a whole new context given to these churning and slamming sort of riffs. It's like a fucking haunted house tour. You're walking around through this miasma, and then some new terrifying monstrosity just jumps out at you, freaks you out, and leaves. Then you're back to the normal death metal shit, but you're like on your guard. What the fuck is going to happen next? That's the strength of the Basement of Death rehearsal. And that's why I've been listening to it multiple times a day for the past several weeks. After Basement of Death and after the self-titled EP, Cleans of Flesh changed their name to Erotic Incisions, fucked around with a few more rehearsals, then they broke up. Joe Wolf kind of wandered around for a while before he eventually started up the whole Heinous Killings thing, which is what he's most famous for nowadays. But it'd be a damn tragedy if the death metal scene continues to sleep on the Clean Flesh era of this guy's artistry, especially since it's a whole lot more accessible nowadays. You don't gotta throw a whole bunch of money to some...
But first listen to me the demo parcel. Then he gets to use my papers so you can send the demands.
Discog's scalper to get a hold of all of that Clean Flesh goodness. Hopefully I managed to sell you on said Clean Flesh goodness, or at least you had a good time listening to me jaw about them. Whatever the case may be, thanks for listening or watching, and I'll see you next time.
Yeah.